After spending decades of his life serving his country, Max Jamson thought he had finally achieved his dream. A peaceful retirement in Oakwood Preserve, a neighborhood that seemed plucked right out of an idyllic postcard. After years of high-stakes work as a federal investigator, he longed for tranquility, a place where he could savor his freedom away from the chaos of his career. He bought a charming little home nestled among perfectly manicured lawns and friendly neighbors, all governed by a homeowners association, HOA, that ostensibly existed to maintain order and tranquility. Max was ready to embrace the American dream he fought for all those years. Little did he know that beneath the polished surface of Oakwood Preserve lurked a collection of egos inflated by power, led by the self-proclaimed king of the neighborhood, Walter Greaves. At first, Max remained blissfully unaware of the HOA's iron grip over residents. It started with small infractions, an absurd $50 fine for leaving out his trash bin for 5 extra minutes, or a curt letter reminding him that his flagpole lacked precise compliance with HOA regulations. But Max brushed off the warnings, convincing himself that he would not succumb to the tyrannical whims of a self-important board. However, Walter Greaves was not the type of man one could simply ignore. He had cultivated an atmosphere of fear and a culture of control that turned idealistic homeowners into mere puppets. Each violation, no matter how trivial, was treated with escalating measures. A fine here, a warning there, until the board's scrutiny became relentless. Max, however, was unshaken. He had faced bullies before in his line of work, and he stood firm, unwilling to back down. That was his first mistake. As Max departed for a week-long trip to see his grandchildren, Walter seized the opportunity he had been waiting for. A covert HOA meeting was hastily assembled. Under the guise of community upkeep, Walter argued that Max's house had been abandoned, showcasing fabricated photographs of the property. No car in the driveway, curtains drawn, and a lawn that had grown slightly wild. It was all staged, but it didn't matter. The board, either too intimidated by Walter or too greedy to care, unanimously approved the demolition order. Within 24 hours, a contractor was on site. This contractor had ties to Walter, known for his unscrupulous methods. Max's home was marked for destruction, and this egregious act of power took place without a whisper of warning or legal protocols being followed. On Friday morning, the calm of Oakwood Preserve erupted into chaos as the roar of a bulldozer shattered the stillness. Neighbors, aghast, peeked through their curtains, mouths agape. Max's home crumbled rapidly under the relentless assault of machinery. People rushed outside, shouting for them to stop, desperate attempts to intervene, but their voices were drowned out amidst the cacophony. In a matter of minutes, the structure that had held years of memories, his family heirlooms, cherished photographs, and precious furniture, was reduced to mere rubble. Among the remnants of what once stood proud was an old, tattered wooden sign hanging near the doorway that read, "Home Sweet Home." The irony sliced deeper than any steel beam. As the last rays of sun dipped below the horizon that day, Max returned, stepping out of a black truck, a silent sentinel. His piercing gaze swept the wreckage. He made no noise, no dramatic gesture, simply inhaled deeply, absorbing the loss with a quiet tenacity. He knelt among the debris, searching, sifting through the destruction until his fingers brushed against something familiar, a half-burned photograph of his late wife. He tucked it carefully into his pocket, a symbol of what was lost but never truly destroyed. Standing tall as the weight of tragedy sunk in, Max turned toward the HOA office, his heart pounding with a sense of purpose. "They made a mistake," he uttered softly but with a dangerous resolve, "and now it's my turn." Max Jamson was not your average homeowner. He was a retired federal investigator, equipped with years of combat against the odds. He had spent decades dismantling corrupt networks, fraudsters, and criminals who believed they were untouchable. The HOA had bulldozed the wrong house, and now they were about to learn there are consequences for their destructive actions. With a renewed focus and righteous anger burning in his chest, Max got to work. He reached out not to the HOA but to federal agencies, attorneys, and investigative journalists. Within 48 hours, the facade of Oakwood Preserve began to crumble alongside his home. Investigators descended, and to everyone's shock, the corroded structure of power began to sway as the HOA's bank accounts were frozen. What followed would send shockwaves through the community. Evidence of embezzlement, shady dealings, and harassment emerged like a torrent, exposing the corrupt practices that festered beneath the surface. Neighbors who had kept silent out of fear began to share harrowing tales, and the floodgates opened. It was clear, Walter Greaves was not just a petty tyrant, he was a criminal masquerading as a community leader. As the investigation unfolded, the final blows struck one by one. Walter's arrogance had led him to overlook the very people he sought to control. His confidants began to speak out. Among them was the HOA treasurer, who turned informant, with critical documentation detailing years of deceit and manipulation. The day came when Walter was arrested, his smug demeanor shattered as federal agents stormed into the HOA offices, their badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. The neighborhood watched, a woeful sense of justice tinged with anticipation in the air. Max stood tall amidst the crowd, steadfast and resolute, as reporters shouted questions about the rampant corruption that flourished beneath the guise of community stewardship. "This isn't just about me," he told the cameras, his voice steady and full of conviction. "This is about every homeowner who's ever been threatened or bullied by those who think they can get away with it. We are done being silent." The dust was finally settling, and as it did, the community began to reclaim their voices. What had once been a place of fear was transforming into a collective of strength and unity. Families banded together, driven by Max's courage, forming coalitions to demand accountability, justice, and, most importantly, change. As Walter Greaves sat in a cell, stripped of his power and influence, Max recognized the victory that rippled throughout the neighborhood. The glory of retribution flashed in the eyes of his neighbors. Oakwood Preserve had been liberated, but Max wasn't finished yet. This was just the beginning. Crowning this triumphant moment was a realization that echoed deeply within him. Corrupt HOAs existed everywhere, preying on the desperation and fear of homeowners. But not anymore. With determination ingrained in his bones, Max knew his fight wasn't over. He had the experience and insight to take down every corrupt HOA that had wronged unsuspecting families. As the sun set over Oakwood Preserve, Max stood in front of the decrepit remnants of the HOA headquarters, a building that had once signaled oppression but would now symbolize hope, a place of restoration and community spirit. And so, the stage was set for the next act in a battle against tyranny that was growing in power, resolve, and a willingness to confront the very nature of corruption. For Max Jamson, the fight for justice had just begun. Little did he know, Walter's fall from grace was only the first twist in a much larger plot, one filled with intrigue, deception, and a thirst for vengeance that would transform Max's quest for peace into a much broader crusade for justice. As the last beams of sunlight painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Max Jamson stood resolute outside the remnants of the HOA headquarters, his mind whirling with possibilities. He had dismantled the iron grip Walter Greaves had on Oakwood Preserve, but that victory hung like a flickering candle. It would only last as long as they stayed vigilant. Corruption had a way of rearing its ugly head again, and he was determined not to become complacent. He felt the energy of his neighbors buzzing around him, a palpable motivation that invigorated his resolve. The release of the corruption scandal had transformed Oakwood Preserve from a quiet neighborhood besieged by fear into a spirited community ready to reclaim its voice. Max's heart swelled with pride as he looked around at the families convening, some exchanging ideas for future gatherings, a neighborhood barbecue, a community watch, possibly even a festival. But beneath the surface of the celebration lay a sense of urgency, a budding realization that they must remain united, or history could repeat itself. That night, as he returned to his temporary residence, Max couldn't shake the feeling that he'd only scratched the surface. He pulled out his laptop and began sifting through the digital paper trail that had led to Walter's arrest. The more he read, the more his mind churned. There were too many discrepancies and too many missing pieces. He was compelled to go beyond. Stepping out of his comfort zone had never lost its frigid grip, but if he expected the world around him to change, he had to be the catalyst. He began jotting down notes, surveillance footage from several weeks before the demolition, attendance records at the HOA meetings, the bank statements that hinted at the shady dealings underneath. The specifics began unfolding like the pages of a gripping thriller. Each detail felt like a breadcrumb guiding him deeper into a labyrinth, and something told him that if he followed it far enough, he'd find more than just the criminals hiding in the dark nooks of Oakwood Preserve. Hours passed as Max scrawled his findings in an organized chaos of information, his pulse quickening with every insight. Just as exhaustion threatened to close in on him, his phone buzzed with a sudden intensity, a message from an old contact still tied to the federal investigation scene. "Max, need to talk. Urgent." His heart raced as he typed back quickly, requesting a meeting. Though he hadn't spoken to this contact in years, the familiarity felt comforting. If there were deeper layers of corruption at play, he wanted to unearth them now, not weeks or months down the line. Early the next day, Max met his contact, someone from the FBI with whom he had collaborated on multiple cases. Sarah Geller, a tenacious investigator known for her resilience. They settled into a small diner away from prying eyes, each moment laced with the tension of what was to come. "Come on, spill," Max said after ordering. "What's going on?" "Walter Greaves," Sarah began, leaning in. "He's out of jail but not out of the fight. He's been contacting investors, planning to launch a new HOA under a different name, trying to make a comeback. Max gritted his teeth, memories of the man's arrogance flooding back. He really thinks he can pull something like that off after everything he put us through. Directly tied to shady operations, it's like he has a handbook on how to exploit people, Sarah replied, setting her coffee cup down with a determined thud. But this time, I think he's underestimating the community. And I suspect he's not the only one. Max's voice was low but steady. I think he's got more allies than we realized. We have to dig deeper, connect the dots. Sarah nodded, understanding the trail that needed to be blazed. If we can find evidence that links him to other corrupt HOAs, we can build a case not just against him, but a framework to expose similar organizations across the country. Max felt a surge of adrenaline. They were no longer simply defending their homes. They were preparing to take the fight to the greater battlefield stretching across the nation. Around the diner, life bustled with indifference, but he felt a singular focus. The two brainstormed for hours, plotting strategies and outlining their next steps. After finishing their coffees and parting ways, Max headed back to Oakwood Preserve, a stirring resolve igniting in him. He had something far bigger now, a mission that could help countless others in the same position they had once found themselves. As he reached home, he called for a neighborhood meeting. In the face of Walter's impending plans, they would need every resident on board, each person armed with knowledge and strength. Families filed into the community center, a mix of anxious expressions and eager determination in the air. Max stood before them, heart racing. But this time, it was from the anticipation of collaboration and empowerment. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "As most of you know, we fought against the corruption that destroyed my home. But this isn't just my story. We have a more significant fight on our hands." Gasps and whispers filtered through the crowd as he outlined Walter's planned revival, detailing Sarah's insights and the potential network of corruption they were up against. Max's words were like a match struck in a dark room, igniting the passion that had begun bubbling beneath their surface. "We can't let this happen again," he urged, passion ringing in his voice. "We need to unite, share our stories, gather evidence, and bring this fight to the national stage. What happened here in Oakwood Preserve isn't an isolated incident. It's happening everywhere." Echoes of agreement spread through the crowd as people began sharing their own horror stories, the dark tactics they faced at the hands of the HOA. These moments of vulnerability morphed into a flame, lighting each individual's determination as they realized they were no longer alone. As the meeting wrapped up, they decided to create a coalition, a safeguard formed of unity. Max felt as if he had not only struck a chord within the community but also reignited a fire that had long been dimmed. In the following weeks, the coalition began to strategize, organizing protests against greedy HOAs, gathering petitions, and raising awareness through social media. The grassroots movement spread like wildfire, attracting attention beyond their small neighborhood. The once diminished spirit of Oakwood Preserve was burning brightly. But a shadow lurked, watching the movement with a cold, calculating gaze. Walter Greaves, though ousted for now, was far from done. He began to sow seeds of dissent, trying to infiltrate there. Community efforts with whispers of doubt. "Is this man really trustworthy?" he'd say to anyone willing to listen. "What else does he want besides revenge?" He was aggressive, sending threat letters to Max, attempting to intimidate those who voiced their support for the coalition. Walter underestimated the spirit within them. Rather than breaking morale, his tactics only solidified their resolve. Max led the charge, countering Walter's tactics with transparency, forging a bond with each person in the coalition, proving that the fight wasn't just his, it belonged to everyone willing to stand against tyranny. The coalition thrived, holding town halls where residents shared their stories and horror tales related to HOAs in other parts of the country. The media began to take notice, and soon local news crews were rolling cameras as Oakwood Preserve transformed from a forgotten neighborhood into a beacon of hope across the nation. Yet, as they closed in on bringing an end to Walter's nefarious plans, Max realized he needed to go on the offensive. This was far bigger than local disputes. It was an epidemic rooted in greed and bureaucracy spanning across communities. That night, as the stars twinkled above, Max sat down with Sarah. "We need to expose the entire corrupt network," he instructed, the fire in his belly roaring once more. "Let's draft a proposal for a national organization that publishes reports on HOAs across the country. Sort of like a watchdog group," Sarah suggested enthusiastically. The idea dawned bright and full of promise, lighting their path forward. An organization that could root out corruption, offer resources for homeowners, and work as a united front to reform systems that have long preyed on vulnerable individuals. With a powerful sense of purpose coursing through their veins, Max and Sarah set out to galvanize support. They wrote articles for local newspapers, crafted social media campaigns, and reached out to homeowners from all corners of the country. Little by little, their ambitions began to take shape. The battle against Walter and corrupt HOAs was morphing into something more monumental than they could have ever imagined. A revolution born not from vengeance, but from collaboration, empowerment, and a fierce yearning for justice. As they prepared to launch their national coalition, one word echoed in Max's mind: resilience. They had fought, they had shared, and most importantly, they had forged an unbreakable bond, a battle cry against corruption that would ripple across the nation. What had once been a quiet neighborhood was ready to become a haven of unity and strength. It was time to awaken the tenets of justice that lay dormant for far too long. The fight was on for something bigger, and Max Jamson was ready to lead it. As dawn broke over Oakwood Preserve, the morning light revealed a neighborhood pulsing with newfound energy. The sound of laughter, chatter, and the warm welcome of camaraderie filled the air as residents rallied together, committed to the cause that had ignited their spirits. Max Jamson stood at the forefront, a determined leader ready to harness this momentum. The coalition had begun as a small group of neighbors, but word had spread. Soon, it grew into a movement that crossed lines drawn by geography and experience. People from neighboring towns flocked to their meetings, sharing stories of their own struggles against ruthless HOAs and unearthing a tapestry of shared suffering connected by the thread of corruption. Max and Sarah had spent the last few weeks crafting the foundation for their national organization, which they decided to call Homeowner Alliance for Justice, a name that not only encapsulated their mission but also elicited a sense of community and fraternity. Their aim was clear: to expose corrupt practices, provide resources for homeowners, and reform abusive regulations that suffocated neighborhoods across the country. With a framework in place, they mapped out a plan to unveil their initiative. They scheduled a press conference, an event that would attract media attention and galvanize support from homeowners both in and outside Oakwood Preserve. As word spread, the excitement morphed with an undercurrent of apprehension. They all understood the risks that lay before them. The day of the press conference arrived, and the anticipation in the air was electric. Max arrived early, putting the final touches on the display board filled with statistics that illustrated the abuses homeowners faced at the hands of HOAs. He couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. Against all odds, they had turned what was once a neighborhood haunted by fear into a battleground against tyranny. As he stood behind the podium, looking out over a crowd that came from all walks of life, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. The podium, prominently featuring their new logo, became a symbol of hope, a bastion for families fighting back against unfair practices. Sarah stood to the side, her eyes bright with anticipation. As the first reporter took her place at the front of the crowd, Max straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and began. "Thank you all for being here today. What we're building is more than just an organization. It's a beacon for every homeowner fighting against the corrupt practices of homeowners associations across this country." He shared his personal journey, the demolition of his home, the traumatic loss, a story no one in the audience had heard in full. The room fell silent, every gaze fixed upon him as he recounted the pivotal moments that led to this day. Together, we can put a stop to the exploitation and intimidation tactics that have victimized families for far too long. We've created a platform that not only exposes these practices but also empowers homeowners to reclaim their rights. Max's words flowed, powerful and sincere, as they struck chords in hearts both among the crowd and on screen as cameras flashed. The press listened intently, some scribbling notes while others captured the essence of every moment. With each passing minute, he could see the resolve building among the crowd, a wave of determination that rippled through the audience. Once Max finished addressing the crowd, invitations were extended for others to share their stories. It started with an elderly woman named Doris, who spoke about the relentless fees levied against her due to a broken mailbox. Her voice trembled, but it was the perseverance in her spirit that captivated everyone. One by one, more residents stood up, sharing compelling tales of intimidation, unlawful fines, even some instances of emotional anguish. Tears flowed, laughter erupted, and hands were raised high in solidarity. As the day unfolded, they found themselves not alone. Max, Sarah, and the others were met with an onslaught of interest from the media, reporters eager to dig deeper into the narrative. Local television networks began broadcasting live, and social media propelled their message even further. The movement was gaining traction, and Max could practically feel the winds of change blowing in their favor. But in the shadows lurked Walter Greaves, who was not about to let Max's ascendance go unchallenged. Not one to take defeat lightly, He silently observed the gathering with a venomous delight, his eyes narrowed, plotting his next move. He felt the desperation creeping in, knowing he had to regain control and shatter the hope that was igniting all around. A few days later, Max and Sarah gathered at the coalition's headquarters, a small office in what used to be the HOA building, now repurposed into a nerve center for justice and advocacy. With enthusiasm surging through the air, they strategized their next steps. "We're gaining more support every day," Sarah said, scrolling through countless messages from homeowners eager to join the cause. "But we need a strategy to deal with whatever Walter has planned. He won't just fade into the shadows." Max nodded, knowing she was right. "We need to get ahead of him. Let's tap into our connections and find out if others have experienced similar intimidation tactics from him. If he's still operating off the same playbook, we can expose him before he has time to regroup." In a flurry of determination, the two spent the next few days investigating Walter's past dealings and reaching out to anyone who had previously crossed paths with him. It opened up a floodgate of information. Not only did they find residents who had similar experiences, but there were also other homeowners associations stooping to the same low tactics, threats, harassment, and legal loopholes, all designed to manipulate and control. As they pieced together the network of deception, Max couldn't shake the feeling that Walter was biding his time, preparing a counterattack. And then, just as those thoughts settled into his mind, they received an anonymous tip. "It said that Walter's planning a big meeting," Sarah murmured, excitement glinting in her eyes. "He's rallying people to start a new HOA. He thinks he can puppetize the community again." Max's brow furrowed, and adrenaline surged through him. They already knew Walter had connections, but this was the first solid proof of his imminent return to power. "We need to infiltrate that meeting," he stated, determination lighting his voice. "If he is rallying support, we can't let that happen. We have to expose him and his tactics before he can gain any momentum." They quickly organized a plan. With their coalition expanding, there were plenty of volunteers eager to help. Max intended to attend the meeting disguised as a prospective member. They just needed to gather the details about the location and time. As the pieces fell into place, Sarah coordinated with their contacts in the media, ensuring they would be ready to shine the spotlight on Walter's clandestine activities. This was not just about preventing Walter from regaining control. It was about turning the tide and showing every homeowner in the nation that they could stand up against the tyranny of corrupt HOAs. The night arrived for the meeting, and Max slipped into the dimly lit location, mingling among potential new members. The atmosphere felt heavy and tense, akin to a war room filled with strategists planning their next move. Max scanned the room, looking for familiar faces and assessing the energy radiating off the crowd. Walter stood at the front, his confidence washed with a veneer of charisma, a stark contrast to the facts that weighed against him. "Welcome, everyone," Walter announced, his voice smooth and commanding. "I appreciate your willingness to listen and consider this incredible opportunity to reclaim our community." Max listened intently, taking mental notes. The rhetoric flowed easily from Walter's lips, weaving in problems the community faced while casually manipulating facts to wield sympathy. He was rallying support with tales of disenfranchisement and seizing opportunities to cast doubt on Max and the coalition. But as Walter continued, Max's pulse quickened. Walter began to sow seeds of dissent, portraying the coalition as a radical group intent on subverting a system that was there to protect the very community they lived in. The words dripped with assurances that they cared for their neighbors, but Max could see through the facade to the darkness beneath. Just as Max prepared to draw attention to Walter's manipulations, fate intervened. The sounds of sirens began to wail outside, piercing through the lies with an unsettling reality. Max felt a swell of anticipation. This was the moment, a chance to expose Walter's bravado and his underbelly of deceit. The crowd began to murmur anxiously as police officers burst through the entrance. "Everyone, please stay calm," one officer announced, his gaze steady. "We have reason to believe that there is ongoing deception involving this group. We're here to investigate." Walter's composure faltered, eyes darting from the officers to the crowd, fear etched across his face. "This is absurd," he yelled, his voice cracking under pressure. "They're just here to disrupt our meeting." Max seized the opportunity, taking a step forward. "No, Walter. This isn't about disruption. It's about accountability. What you're doing is fraudulent, and the community deserves to know the truth." Gasps filled the air, eyes darting to and fro as disbelief and shock washed over them. The tide was turning, and Max felt invigorated. As the officers began to question attendees, the room erupted into chaos. People began relaying their stories of intimidation and fear, echoing Max's sentiments. Walter, cornered and exposed, was losing his grip as he attempted to spin the narrative into one of victimhood. But it was too late. His web of deceit was unraveling, and the community was uniting against him. Hope surged, and Max realized they had successfully turned the tables, forcing the light onto the very darkness Walter tried to hide. Meanwhile, in the back of the hall, whispers of disbelief filled the air, and fears previously held in shadows burst forth into the light. Max sensed a shift. Everyone around him now understood the stakes. The power was no longer solely in Walter's hands. It was with the homeowners reclaiming their voices. T was a turning point for Max, for Oakwood Preserve, and for homeowners nationwide. The fight against corruption had morphed into a full-blown battle for justice, and together, they were ready to carry the torch. With renewed strength, Max knew this was just the beginning of a war they would fight not only for their homes but for the very fabric of fairness and community that should define every neighborhood across the nation. As the officers filed into the meeting room, Max felt a wave of exhilaration wash over him. The atmosphere crackled with a raw energy, each personalized story of struggle aligning like a constellation in the night sky, now illuminated for all to see. Walter Greaves stood at the center of the storm, his earlier bravado replaced with mounting panic as he attempted to regain control of the narrative. Max stepped further into the fray, his voice steady despite the rising chaos. This community deserves to know the truth. Walter has manipulated our hopes, sowing division where there should be unity. We don't need an HOA that uses fear and intimidation as tools to govern. As if cued by his declaration, Sarah moved forward, adding, "We're here to create a space where everyone feels welcome, where input is valued, and we work together, not against each other. Walter's practices have only kept us in silence and fear." The gathering erupted into a cacophony of agreement, residents speaking out and sharing their own grievances, emboldened by the police presence. The officers interviewed attendees, documenting stories that painted a picture of Walter's ways, his tactics, his lies. For the first time in a long time, people felt validated. They were no longer isolated in their struggles, and this moment was a fusion of shared experiences, hope ignited in the hearts of those present. The murmurs of disbelief turned into shouts of solidarity. Walter, shaken, attempted to regain focus. "This is all a misunderstanding. I have always acted in the interest of our community." "Your community?" One voice cut through the noise, belonging to a single mother named Linda who had once been paralyzed by Walter's threats over the size of her garden. "You've taken from us. We are the community, not you." The defiance in her voice resonated deep within everyone present. Max cast a glance around the room, locking eyes with parents, the elderly, and young adults, all now equipped with confidence and the strength of their shared stories. The wall that Walter had built between them was crumbling. Eventually, one of the officers approached Walter, confronting him with the allegations laid out before him, and other officers began pulling resources to establish the legitimacy of the claims. Max watched, heart pounding, with a mixture of hope and trepidation. This was the showdown they had long awaited. While the officers continued their investigations, the emotions in the room fluctuated from anger to empowerment and disbelief. Residents began exchanging contact information, forging bonds amidst the heightened sense of purpose. The perception of community was slowly morphing from passive acceptance to active engagement. Just then, a local news crew arrived at the scene, cameras rolling, bringing a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Microphones quickly found their way into the hands of attendees eager to share their side of the ordeal. The lens of the camera captured a change. This wasn't merely the struggle of a few. It symbolized the rising tide of collective action against a cancer that had spread through so many neighborhoods over the years. Walter's demeanor shifted palpably as he realized he had lost control, not just of the meeting, but of the sentiments of the very residents he'd exploited for years. Max leaned into it, eager to expose the truth that had long been shrouded beneath layers of deceit. "People deserve to live without fear," Max spoke again, now addressing both the officers and the cameras. "We must stand together against those who threaten our homes and well-being." The Homeowner Alliance for Justice isn't just a name, it is a movement to protect every member of this community and those across our nation. A loud cheer erupted from the crowd, and Max could see emotions deepening, fingers pointing at Walter, voices declaring their commitments to the alliance. "We are not alone," someone shouted, igniting another wave of applause. At that moment, Walter snapped, raising his voice in a last-ditch effort to cling to authority. "You'll all regret this. You're putting your trust in a nobody." His voice echoed in desperation, trying to drown out the roar of the crowd, but it didn't work. Over the din, The officers started to take notes and ask pointed questions, gradually transforming the melee into a well-organized inquiry. They were thoroughly probing the layers of deceit piled high by Walter and his shady dealings. The energy continued climbing, tension giving way to a sense of urgency and adrenaline running through the hearts of the attendees. They could feel change simmering just beneath the surface. As the crowd attention shifted back to Walter, he attempted to exit the scene only to be stopped by the officers. "You're not going anywhere," one officer stated firmly. The realization of losing his grip of authority transformed his face, flooding it with anger, but it only spurred Max onward, transforming resistance into fuel. What had once seemed an insurmountable challenge was beginning to break. Voices and stories turned into actions. Emotions fueled their desires for change, people calling out for accountability from a man who had long fed off the fears of innocence. "We will stand united," Max declared, raising his hands to gather their attention once more. "We will not allow Walter or anyone else to divide us. Let this be a signal to every person who's felt powerless that together we can reclaim our rights. A new day is dawning, let's ensure we embrace it." As the crowd erupted with affirmation, Max felt the overwhelming power of unity cascading through him. He glanced back at Sarah, who nodded in agreement, her eyes sparkling with determination mirrored by those around them. Hours passed, and resolutions were being drawn up on the spot. As the officers continued gathering evidence and testimony, word of the event spread quickly through texting and social media. The ripple effect unfurling across the town began to gather more volunteers, eager to participate in the movement against Walter and similar injustices everywhere. As the sun dipped low in the sky, drawing a curtain of twilight over the day's events, Max could feel the energy within him shifting. This was just the beginning. Communities inspired to take action, empowered to fight against the corrupt systems that had long held sway, and propelled by stories woven together like an unbreakable tapestry of support. But as he stepped outside the building where the meeting had taken place, he couldn't shake off the lingering shadow of Walter Greaves. Though cornered for now, Max knew that Walter's future moves would be anything but predictable. Walter had always lurked in the shadows, and with his life unraveling, the desperation could lead him to take reckless actions against those he felt had wronged him. Max took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air invigorate him, promising to himself that he would remain vigilant. Together with his newfound allies, they were prepared to face whatever Walter might conjure next. Their stories, once scattered and lonely, were now uniting into a chorus, a narrative fueled by resilience and the unwavering belief that justice could prevail. And as night enveloped Oakwood Preserve, it was evident. This was a night of change, a night when bravery met fear, a night when ordinary residents became champions of justice, ready to battle for their rights, their homes, and their very lives, signaling to Walter Greaves that the fight had just begun.